Thank you for joining us, St. Albertans. My name is Lisa Ruffiange with TV7.ca. I'm sitting down today with St. Albert MLA Marie Renaud. Marie, thank you so much for taking some time out of your busy schedule to speak with us.
Yeah, my pleasure.
We spoke a little bit earlier off camera, and I had mentioned, with the Christmas holidays coming up, are you even remotely prepared?
No.
No, me
No.
neither.
No, I think it'll be a busy weekend.
Yeah,
so.
it's very quiet in the office today. Is that
Yeah.
typical of?
No, it's not typical. So, typically the phone will be ringing. We'll have appointments or people coming in for different things to ask questions.
Well, someone may walk in on us yet, no problem.
Yep.
So tell me how you're feeling after your nomination on the 12th and how that all went down.
Well, it's good to be finished with that. It's a good experience to again connect with people and to talk about ideas and to be in a little bit of election mode again, although smaller scale. So
right now, Mr. Horn was your opposition in that particular election or nomination. So how did you two end up pairing off, I guess, against each other, for lack of a better term, with how the districts have been redrawn?
So with the boundary changes, the mandatory review and boundary changes, so his riding of Spruce Grove St. Albert got chopped up into about 3 different ones.
And why is that, for those of us that don't know logistically how it works?
So it's just a requirement that a nonpartisan group look at the distribution and look at the boundaries and make sure that there's some equity across the province and suggest those changes based on population and geography. And so the changes were made, and his riding, he didn't have a clear choice, so he had to choose one, whether it was the new riding of Morinville St. Albert or St. Albert or Spruce Grove Stony Plain, and he chose St. Albert, and it's not ideal, but it's democracy.
I guess it is what it is. So we've had a couple of hot button issues come up in the last little while.
Yeah.
For the sake of clarity, I'm just going to pull it right out there. Where do you live?
I live just outside of St. Albert. I live past North Point Church.
Right. So one of the things that we've seen crop up both online and in print is, there are some people that have voiced some concern with your ability or inability, depending on their perspective, to properly represent St. Albert in an area community where you obviously don't reside. Can you touch on that for me and just provide some clarification?
Yeah, I think, well, I suppose, it's geography. I've had the same condo for a long time. I actually worked at Los Seca, which is in Campbell, for about 14 years, and so moved there because it was closer.
Sure.
And so just have stayed and got a little busy. I was supposed to repaint my condo to sell it. Didn't quite get to it.
Story of my life.
Yeah, it's on my list of things to do because, I painted the inside of my condo purple. And so, sort of like these walls here, but I'd have to neutralize that. And, again, it just, things get away from you. And I don't have the ability to own 2 places, so I would have to sell mine to move and just haven't done that yet.
Not only that, but touching on what we discussed earlier with those boundary redrawings every few years, it's just doesn't seem to be feasible for, unless you can move from within the boundary change where that's just not
they
something.
change. They do. They change significantly. So there was some fairly significant changes for St. Albert, but the bulk of the riding that I had before has stayed. I switched a little chunk for the little chunk that was attached to Spruce Grove before, so we sort of did a swap.
Sure. And again, that is complete nonpartisan. It's not
correct.
something that is decided within the party.
No,
so.
not at all. No.
Very interesting. Over the last couple of days, we've seen some social media buzz on the, I guess, large vehicle convoy that took place in support of the Alberta pipeline. And it seemed like a lot of issues were sort of rolled into one. They attempted to address not just the pipeline issue, but I believe there was some photo radar thrown in there.
Photo radar? Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, there was a few issues that were, obviously everybody in the end has the same goal in mind, which I think is for Alberta to prosper, like we spoke about earlier. Just a little bit of I guess, some contention there on how we all get there. And as you had said, making sure that we all get there and that there's nobody left behind. So it's a very interesting, we were speaking earlier about how some of those, I guess, gestures mean well. and certainly did bring a lot of focus and attention to some of the issues that Albertans are facing in the oil and gas sector. However, there is always a downside, some of those being some of the issues we talked about earlier. Someone had apparently given birth on side of the road, and you know, there was some holdup there of the essential services with police, fire, ambulance. So you got to take the bad with the good. But overall, do you think that message was received by Alberta politicians?
Well, I don't think that Alberta politicians were unclear about the need. I think that we're crystal clear that, you know, certainly the federal government made a significant investment the other day. It's 1.6 billion, which is great. That's not the answer though, and those are more long-term investments. So they're looking at investing into cleaner energy. I think there were about 4 pots that the funds were taken from. And that's great. But what we need is access to new markets. And so for far too long, any pipelines that were approved and then built were shipping our product to the United States, which is our primary client, I suppose. I mean, you know, that's not the word I'm looking for. That's our primary market. And we're just not getting a good price for it, not at all. And so what the Premier has said repeatedly is that for 60 years, it has been 60 years since a new pipeline, new capacity has reached Canadian Tidewater. And so what we need to do is get our product there so that we can get it to new markets and get a better price for our resource. Now, we all know this is a non-renewable resource. We have a limited amount of time and a limited resource. We need to get the best price that we possibly can while we're transitioning to cleaner energy, to different types of technology. And, you know, going back to your other comment about the convoy, you know, it's unfortunate that it did cause some problems with ambulances and people missing flights and things. But I think what we're hearing is that people are hurting. You know, certainly the economy is recovering, but it's not impacting everybody the same. And people are getting left behind. And so people that had, you know, a secure, stable income and jobs for many, many years in the oil and gas sector suddenly don't. And so although we have to be aware of these folks. We can't go back to exactly the way things were because things are changing. Technology is changing in the oil and gas sector. And so while I'm happy the federal government has chosen to invest in additional training and additional innovation, we as a provincial government have to continue to keep our eyes on the people that are somewhat being left behind right now. And so, you know, the convoy, it was a very visual reminder of, you know, there's a lot of people still hurting, and absolutely know that and see that. So what appears to be, from your perspective, the holdup in getting the pipeline in the ground, as a euphemism? Yeah, well, I mean, there is some work. I mean, again, it's going south, but so with Trans Mountain, there has been some work, but then there was a holdup. And so what we've heard from the courts is that the federal government needed to go back and do a better job at consulting. And so I'm hoping that that will happen as swiftly as possible, but it has to happen well so we don't do this again. And so hopefully we learn from this going forward that consultation isn't just a box to check off. It's an active, it's a piece that is so vitally important, and it's a piece that you have to get right so that you can move forward with your project.
Right, and like we had said earlier, make sure that none of those people that have a vested interest in the land specifically are left behind, and that everyone's on board. I mean, of course you're not going to please everybody all the time, but we have to make sure that we do a good enough job going forward that everyone feels that there is some inclusivity there, and no one's just kind of being dragged along for the ride.
And so, I mean, how many times do we have to get wrapped, or does the federal government have to get wrapped on the knuckles by the courts to say, you didn't do a good enough job consulting? And so we need to listen to that, and we need to get it right.
So it's unfortunately not just as easy as waving a magic wand and having it come to fruition. There are steps that need to be taken, and unfortunately it doesn't sound like they were taken properly the first time, hence why we're doing it over. Right,
and so I mean, you know, the previous government, so before this government, the previous government got wrapped a few times by the courts saying, you know, it was like just a dismal failure to consult. Again, we're, you know, we're running into problems with this government, so you know, at some point, let's learn this lesson and go forward, and let's not do this again.
Right.
Albertans need to know that the federal government has their backs, do the work that needs to get done so we can get this project finished.
Right. Well, if we've learned anything, it's that the one constant is change. So
Yeah.
it is an inevitability. It's just making sure that the proper procedures are in place so
Yeah.
that it's done correctly.
Correctly.
Yeah.
Yep.
Great. Excellent. So just changing topics here for a little bit. You've worked with the Losika Foundation here in St. Albert previously. Can you touch on some of your work with them, how you've transitioned from working with Losika into your political career, and what portion of your work with the those that have disabilities has transitioned into what you're now doing and where your focus is politically?
Sure. Well, first of all, I grew up with family members with disabilities, so it's kind of what I know. And so as much as in my younger life, I may have tried to avoid that career path, I always seemed to get pushed back. So
Sure.
ended up at Losika, and you know, I was there for about 14 years, and you know, I think we did a lot of innovative work over the years. What I found, or the last few years that I worked there, is that I spent the bulk of my time sort of fighting the government at the government of the day. And so what would happen is there would be policy changes that would then roll out, and we would see just the impact of those changes that were actually quite dangerous in a lot of cases.
Firsthand.
Yeah, and so what we knew before is that every time oil prices took a dip, we knew to expect something. And so that was the pattern that we knew for like a decade. I mean, we just knew that, right?
Yeah.
We learned to keep an eye on things because anytime there was a downturn, it came. I mean, they called it different things. Sometimes they called it transformation. Sometimes they called it finding efficiencies.
Right.
Who knows?
That ripple effect reaches
Right.
further than anyone can imagine.
Absolutely, and we felt it firsthand. So the last few years, it was really bad. It got worse and worse. The policies, some of the directions they were taking, I had a huge issue with. So we decided to push back a little bit, a lot. And so we did that. And one of the people I met at the time, and I think this was in about 2013, maybe 2012, I met Rachel Notley, and at the time she was the MLA for Strathcona, and she was really helpful. She gave me a lot of advice about how to do this, and I'd actually met with our local MLAs here as well, and that was part of advocating. And so I got to know her a little bit, and then a year later or so, she asked me to run. And of course, like most people, I thought, no. I'm sure you can find someone better. And this is typical for women in particular, is the first reaction is no. And so that took a while. She's pretty persistent. So I think probably about over a year later, I decided to do it. And the reasoning was she made a good case for, it's one thing to advocate the way that we were doing that in the community in St. Albert and in the larger community of Alberta, but it's quite another to be in a position where you can help make changes that are more systemic changes. And so that was probably what did it for me.
Case in point being your speech in November in front of the House. Can you touch on that a little bit, what you were advocating for at that particular time?
Okay, so at that particular point, it was a bill to change some things about AISH. So we'd already dealt with some AISH intake changes, but this was about increasing AISH benefits. So AISH is Assured Income for Severely Handicapped, which is a horrible name for a program, by the way. I was going to put that out there. I hope it changes at some point. But what we wanted to do, or what the community has been asking for a very, very long time, was to index AISH. So what that means is when the cost of living goes up, the AISH benefits also go up. And a lot of the federal programs are indexed, but this provincial program was not.
Interesting. You'd think that would be a simple common sense as...
You'd think. And so this has, for decades, people have been asking for that and nothing. And so what would happen, because we were on this roller coaster, in good times, there would be an increase.
Sure.
But then you could go 7 years with nothing, and then you would get an increase. And so, sure, it's wonderful to get an increase, but those 7 years leading up to that increase are brutal. And so indexing provides people with some peace of mind that, will keep up. Now, to be honest, people living on AISH are still struggling. It's poverty, right? It's not ideal. But it was important to index. It also got increased a little bit.
And how was the index decided? Was that a percentage based? Was it?
Yeah, it's based on so let's say whatever the percent is, and I think it's calculated in the new year, so based on the previous year's percent. Yeah. So we did increase it about $100. Now, again, that's not a lot. What I was happy about was that our government made a commitment, even when times were really tough, to increase AISH, and I hadn't seen that before, so that was really good. The other thing that was really important to me, and I made this amendment to the legislation, was to change the amount of income that people could earn without having AISH deducted. And so there are about 55,000 people on AISH in Alberta, and a lot of those people are capable of working, want to work. And so what this does is it encourages people to make that transition. And there are so many people that don't want to be on AISH. They want to make that transition. So this was, again, more incentive for people to be able to take care of themselves by working, to make that transition properly, and to, if they're able to get off AISH. And so it increased their allowable earning exemption by about $300.
Well, every little bit helps.
Yeah.
And I'm assuming you've received some feedback since then from those that do take part in the AISH program. Is that being well received?
Yeah, sure.
Are they advocating for more specific types of changes in the future, or is it kind of just to the point where they're very satisfied with what they can get at this point?
Well, I don't think anyone's ever very satisfied.
Sure.
And so I'd be disappointed in them if they were just quiet and said, yeah, that's great. They're not like that. So I think people are recognizing that we are doing the work, but there is more to do. And I think where we have a lot of work to do is on creating inclusive employment for people. And not just for people with disabilities, but it's doing a better job of connecting people with the correct supports and the correct employment. Because people with disabilities in particular are unemployed. I mean, the unemployment rate is just astronomical, actually.
A lot of that has to stem back to the fight for equality within different diverse groups. And I mean, you'd think, once again, that would just be something that is an accepted thing in society. I mean, we're coming on 2019 here. This isn't...
I know.
But yet, sometimes, unfortunately, there's still that tooth and nail struggle.
2019, I know. But I mean, it's 2019 and we're still having conversations about isolation rooms in schools. Yeah. I mean, there's still a campaign that's essential to end the use of the R word. I mean, really, it's 2019, we're still talking about that? So yeah, we have some work to do, and not just for this group of people, but for all kinds of people. And so when you say something like progress is great, but to measure progress, you have to know that nobody's being left behind. And by nobody, that means nobody. Well, it's definitely a benchmark, but sometimes, well, fortunately for us, we have people like you that advocate for that equality within the governmental system. Now, that is a rundown of what you've been handling politically outside of this office for the last little while. What typically takes place within these walls during any given week? I mean, with the exemption, of course, being Christmas, because I understand it's a little bit, not what you would typically see, but how does it work for you during the day? What sort of things do you handle typically in the community for St. Albertans on a regular basis? Well, every day's a little bit different. So when we're in session, I'm not here. I'm only here on Fridays. So we sit Monday to Thursday, but when we're not in session, I'm here all the time. So I'm on a lot of committees. I'm on some legislative committees as well as some local ones. So I've been working with a partnership of people. We're trying to get ParentLink funding for St. Albert. So we're the 10th largest city in Alberta, but we don't have ParentLink. And so our needs are very comparable to other cities that have it, but we don't have it. haven't had it. So we've been working pretty hard. I know Jackie Hansen, who's a counselor now, she has been advocating really hard for this since about 2014. And so it started again just recently, a few months ago. And so we're doing our best to get that done. I'm also sitting on the Mayor's Task Force on Homelessness. So to look at, and that's really in its infancy still. So we're looking at, I'm not sure what we're going to do yet, but I think it'll be really good. So we can have people come in that are struggling with AISH, WCB, Maintenance Enforcement Program.
Sure.
Perhaps they are upset about a piece of legislation. Sometimes they come in and they like a piece of legislation. Sometimes it's issues with education. Sometimes people are just confused about the level of government, and so we'll have to direct them somewhere. All kinds of things.
We see a lot of comments on social media primarily about someone that's facing a specific issue, and someone will chime in and say, well, contact your MLA, get in touch with your MLA. So is that typically, do you go to bat for the little guy, for lack of a better term,
sure.
whenever possible? And can you give me an example of some of the more memorable, I guess, issues that you've had to tackle on behalf of citizens that maybe wouldn't have gotten the attention they deserved otherwise?
Sure. Yeah, we get that all the time. And sometimes, we get that all the time. So that's the part of the job that's really heavy, right? Is that you represent over 50,000 people. And that was the part I really struggled with at the beginning. Is like, good Lord, how do I do this? Like, how do I do this properly? But thankfully, it's like sort of like eating an elephant, right? It's one bite at a time. But so some examples.
So you're responsible for, in essence, 55,000 children or wards, for lack of a better. How do you find the ability to meet all of their needs collectively?
Right, and there's such a range, right? So, just recently there's a group that have come in to talk about an issue they're having with their business, let's say, or they're maybe just there's some confusion around local bylaws. Now, that's not our jurisdiction, but if we can help by talking to another level of government. Sometimes it's somebody that needs assistance in an AISH appeal. So we have 2 staff that work here in addition to myself, and one of the staff is a caseworker. So she has a lot of experience with casework. So it's sometimes navigating really complex systems with someone. We've helped a local clinic that was running into some roadblocks, I think it was a contract that they had with a physician from the UK, and so they were running into some roadblocks with getting him here and getting him working, and there was a real need for a physician in St. Albert at this clinic, and so we were able to push that through. So this was a few years ago. We were able to get that done. We met with the midwives. This was a few years ago, the St. Albert Midwives Clinic. And they were ready to shut down because there were 3 of them at the time, and they weren't all receiving the maximum courses of care. What that means is, I guess, a caseload, right? So you're paid by person. And so their funding, I think they had been promised by the previous government that they would get it eventually, and so they'd opened this clinic, and then it just didn't happen. And so we advocated with the clinic and with the 3 midwives, and we were able to secure the 120 courses of care. So they're good, they're operating, and things are going well for them.
Nice, avoided some shutdown there and loss of jobs in St. Albert.
For sure. FACT Alberta is Nicole Imgrun is a local counseling therapist. So she's the executive director of FACT Alberta. So she and her group have been working really, really hard for years trying to create a college or some oversight for counseling therapists. And they had brought all of these different sort of practices together. So you had addiction counselors, marriage counselors, all these different fields. There was no oversight before, so essentially a well-meaning person could hang up a shingle and call themselves a therapist, a counseling therapist. And so she needed help getting on the legislative agenda to get this done. And of course, there's limited space, right? When you're only sitting so many times a year. everybody wants legislation. There's all kinds of things to change or clean up or introduce. And so working with her, it was to make sure that this got there, and this really needed to happen with our focus on mental health supports. This was something that was essential, that there was oversight for counseling therapists.
Definitely,
so
yeah.
we got that done in this last session.
Some prioritizing there. And
yeah, and so sometimes it's big things, sometimes it's little things, like somebody called and said, you know, I'm sick, I'm going through chemo, and I really need these documents signed. And so I went to her house and just signed them because I'm a notary public, right? And so sometimes it's little things and sometimes it's big things.
Yeah, well, like we touched on earlier, when you have 55,000, you know, there's bound to be some things crop up, and regardless of, I understand with it being NDP in this office, regardless of the political background, we are all, like we touched on earlier, still people.
Absolutely, and this is a nonpartisan office, and so let's say somebody wanted to come in and donate to the New Democrats, we'd have to go outside or somewhere else.
Sure.
So this is nonpartisan, so so we're just here to represent the people of St. Albert.
Thank you so much for tuning in. I'm Lisa Rufiange with TV7.ca.